Yeah, showing up. Or you can use the mic.
I just need to go through this to the video that we funded for.
I'm going to love Jesus. Well, I'm going to speak really loud so everyone can hear me. So good afternoon, everybody. My name is Maria Williams, and I am a member of the illustrious Sealaska Heritage Institute Board of Trustees. And I'm so pleased that we have a wonderful Canadian scholar here, Dr. Georgina Martin. But I just want to remind everyone to first silence their cell phones. And I want to also thank Dr. Rosita Worrell for making this talk happen in Stasia. So this lecture that's entitled The Canadian Legacy of Indian Residential Schools, A Personal Narrative. This is a free lecture sponsored by Sealaska Heritage Institute and the Indigenizing Education for Alaska grant, which is a very exciting endeavor. So Sealaska Heritage Institute is currently supporting indigenizing education efforts by providing internships and classroom experience to Indigenous high schoolers who are planning on becoming future teachers. Scholarships for Indigenous college students who are currently working towards becoming teachers in Alaska, and a community of practice to support current Indigenous teachers in their teaching practices by gaining more knowledge on how to indigenize their education, as well as the education they're providing for their students. The Indigenizing Education for Alaska grant is interested in not only supporting Indigenous students in becoming teachers in Alaska, but also in the collaboration and growth of Alaska's current Indigenous teachers. So the lecture today really resonates that because all of us come from the legacy of the Indian schools or the residential schools. So Dr. Georgina Martin is an Indigenous scholar and member of the Williams Lake First Nation in the interior of British Columbia. She centers Indigenous knowledges in her teaching and research methodologies. Her research centers on intergenerational trauma that emerged from the Indian residential schools and the Indian hospitals that left a trail of cumulative damage to language, culture, and identities. She draws from her lived experience in advance reclamation of space for Indigenous peoples. So her talk today is The Canadian Legacy of Indian Residential Schools, A Personal Narrative. So Dr. Georgina received her PhD from the University of British Columbia, and her dissertation, which is now going to be published next year. I have to read you the title of her dissertation because I love it. Those of you that know me know I'm a musician. So, Drumming My Way Home, an Intergenerational Narrative Inquiry about Swepum Identities, which is the name of her First Nations peoples. So I had the great good fortune of being in Vancouver Island University and attending Dr. Georgina's classes. I received a grant from Fulbright, and so as you all know, those who know me, I'm Tlingit. I was born and raised in Anchorage, Alaska. But it was phenomenal to me the amount that I learned because our identities, our histories as Indigenous people are the same. But the way that our governments deal with us is very different and very unique. And I think we can learn a lot by sharing our experiences. So I'm so pleased that Dr. Georgina is here to share with us her wonderful knowledge. So let's cheers.
All right, so before I begin, I would like to acknowledge that I am here with you on the traditional territories of the Akwaan peoples. And I'm going to begin my presentation by using the protocols that I also use in my courses at Vancouver Island University. So what I'm going to do is begin with a drum song, and I'm going to finish with a drum song. And the drum song I'm sharing with you here is by Patrick Alec. It's called the Equality Song. And we sing this every Tuesday, Thursday. I've got one class that we do the protocols in currently. So we start with this song, and I have to sing it along with the video recording, and he's got some lessons in it as well. And the reason I do that is because it takes a very long time to learn how to drum and sing a song and put them together. So it takes years of practice. So I'll sing along with Patrick Alec to open our...
Sing into the mic because we have people, it's live streaming.
Okay,
On video could hear it.
sure,
Thank you.
I can do that. Okay, now how do I turn it on? Sorry, the technology here is really different. I'm very challenged.
It does, it looks different up here than it does up there.
I don't want to touch anything.
Yeah, there you go. I'll let you take over. Oh, there's no sound.
As there no audio.
We have to go back to the beginning. Can't really hear it, can you?
And we start without the drum because we want to hear your voice, because your voice matters. And then you finish without the drum because your voice matters, right? And the reason why I want you to hear your voice when we sing this song is because in politics and stuff like that, not everybody's voice is heard and stuff like that. So that's why I did that. So, and this song is really simple. It can be in my living room, and yeah, and I didn't think it would be as big as it is now. So.
Yeah, oh, oh, oh. Hi-ya, oh, oh, oh. Hi-ya, oh, oh, oh. Hi-yo, eh. Hi-yo, eh. Hi-ya, oh, oh, oh. Hi-ya, oh, oh, oh. Hi-ya, oh, oh, oh. Hi-yo, eh. Hi-yo, eh. Hi-ya, oh, oh, oh. Hi-ya, Hiya oh oh oh, hiyo eh, hiyo eh, hiya oh oh oh, hiya oh oh oh, hiya oh oh oh, hiyo eh. I'm getting lost. Okay. To get back to the presentation. Okay, here we go. Oh, okay. So another part of our protocol is we share a prayer in beginning in a good way. So what I'm going to share with you is the Swepmch prayer from my nation. So I've got it up here in the language, and I've got the English words that go along with it. Gukstakuch de galgukbi, de gestakuch de tmiochs, Yuchaminda hochweid de stem, na elia na tmioch. Yuchaminda regalmuch temes meschens biui selchgwa, elre stichenskuch, knuch windakuch as yayads. Gukstakuch de galgukbi, de gestakuch te hochweid de stem. Yi. I also am a language learner, so I'll also introduce myself in the language. Wait Kohwaidap, Georgina Martin ren squaxt, Swapnchen, de Tlakel de Stlagwan, Gukstjacham de Wan Echwan na Elia, de Mumdwan Prince George, Echra Elkstwan Nanaimo, Vancouver Island University, Nancy Moise ren Kia, Ned Moise ren Ba'a, Gukstjacham. So basically I said a formal hello to everyone. My name is Georgina Martin. I am Swepmch, and I am from Tekelch. And I said thank you for having me here. And I live in Prince George, but I work in Nanaimo at Vancouver Island University. And my grandmother is Nancy Moise, and my grandfather is Ned Moise. So as I mentioned in my introduction, the name of my community is Tekelch, also known as Williams Lake First Nation. And we are located 7 miles south of the city of Williams Lake in the interior of British Columbia. Our current population is around 857, with 235 members living on reserve. So this is the map of the territory of the Swepmch peoples. We make up the central interior of British Columbia, and there are 17 communities within our nation. And this is Williams Lake here, and the community I'm from is also known as Sugarcane. And it was given this name back in the 1800s when my cousin Nancy Sandy did research on it. She's got a law degree, and what she found is that when the miners were traveling through by our community and carrying their goods on pack mules, there was a bag of sugarcane that fell off the mule alongside our community, and that's how we got that name, sugarcane, and it still stands. We don't have sugarcane in our territory, so that's the only explanation we've got for it. Whoops. On the other map, it is a map of British Columbia. And this is Prince George, where I mentioned. This is where I have spent a good part of my life. I did my undergraduate degree at the University of Northern British Columbia, and I've been living there since about 1984. And I still refer to it as my home. And Williams Lake is here. It's a 2.5-hour drive south of Prince George. Quite often you hear Prince George being coined as the northern capital of BC, but really when you look at the map, we're halfway up the province. And Vancouver, you probably know quite a bit about. It's our largest city within BC. And here's our capital in Victoria, and here's Nanaimo. So I work on Vancouver Island University, at Vancouver Island University. And I just like to mention, Maria noticed that I feel a bit at home coming here, because in that territory on the coast, the artwork that I see here, I'm surrounded by that on Vancouver Island. The artwork is culture is very similar in that way. Before I begin, I just want to mention my grandparents, as I did in my presentation, because my grandparents are my strength. I hold them in very high esteem for who I am today and for the teachings that they gave me, and they also raised me from birth. So they're very important in my life's journey, and I still hold them in very high esteem, even though they've both gone to the spirit world many, many years ago. And they are my maternal grandparents. This is where the story gets a little bit rough, because one of the reasons why my grandparents took care of me is I was born in an Indian hospital. And this is the Indian hospital that I was born in, Coquilitsa. It's located in Sardis, BC. And it's close by Chilliwack. You'll see it was founded in 1941, closed in 1969. So at the time of my birth, my mom was quarantined with tuberculosis. And I'm still, at this time in my life, trying to backtrack and find some history and some information about my mom being in this hospital. I don't know when she went in, when she was released. All I know is I was born there. So that's what drove my PhD work that Maria mentioned. And it was doing an autobiography to try and find out more about who I am. But I'm very glad that I was raised by grandparents, because they kept me rooted in my community along with other elders, and I gained some very important teachings. If I was to stand up the teachings side by side between what I got at the university and what I got from my community, the grandparents and the elders, my community teachings would always rank way higher, because they taught me some very important lessons about carrying myself with humility, knowing who I am, doing things to try and support my community and help our people. Because my grandfather couldn't read or write up until the day that he passed, but the teaching that he gave me is that I needed to go out and get an education and somehow bring it back to my people. So that was my life's journey, and I just continued on that path until I got where I am today. So I'm really hoping that I'm honoring my grandparents by the direction that he instilled in me as a young person. The Indian hospitals in Canada are another very well-kept secret that's been swept under the carpet, and it's only recently that we're starting to do a bit more work on it. There are quite a few Indian hospitals across the country, and I forgot to add that slide in here. But there were 3 in British Columbia. There is the Miller Bay Indian Hospital in Prince Rupert, the Coquilitsa Indian Hospital in Sardis, and the Nanaimo Indian Hospital, which is located directly across the street from Vancouver Island University. So the Indian Residential School History and Dialogue Center, located at University of British Columbia is just really starting to ramp up and try and do some work on Indian hospitals to expose what had happened to our people. Some of the things we do know is that our people were used for experiments when they were put in these hospitals. And even to this day, I'm not even sure if my mom truly had TB, because they would take people who they thought might have tuberculosis and put them in these hospitals. It was also a TB sanatorium. And they would do experiments. They didn't have the state-of-the-art equipment like the MRI and the X-rays and scanning equipment back then. So they would actually operate on people and do the experiments and take parts of their bodies. And it's very awful. And a lot of the women were sterilized so they couldn't have children. And there's a class action lawsuit that's in the works to try and do something about the Indian hospitals. There's a very famous one in Edmonton. It's called the Camsell Indian Hospital, and we hear quite a lot about it. So it's another part of our very dark legacy that we're trying to grapple with in our country. I just wanted to share some information with you about the makeup of British Columbia in particular, well, Canada and then BC. So we have what they say 630 First Nations communities in Canada. It represents more than 50 nations and 50 Indigenous languages. British Columbia with more than 200 distinct First Nations in BC alone, and each with their own unique traditions and history. More than 30 different First Nations languages and close to 60 dialects are spoken in the province. BC is the most diverse province in all of Canada. And there are approximately 200,000 Indigenous people in British Columbia. They include First Nations, Inuit, and Métis. And just speaking a little bit about the dialects, even in my territory, the language we speak is Swepmachchin. And within my own territory, we have the southern, the northern, the eastern dialect, and there are a lot of similarities, but there are also distinct differences in the way that words are said. This is a map of, just to show you, it's a basic guide to the different names of the different areas within British Columbia. And you can see them all here. And I'm just going to go back to my area. Well, there's Anishka. Where are we? Here. This is who I am. I'm Swepmach. And these are our neighbors, the Chilcotin. So that's, there are many, New Chunlith, they're showing on Vancouver Island, and they are a very strong nation within that territory. I'm going to need some help. I have to go to this. I just have another map that I wanted to show you that shows more detail. Okay, this is another more involved map. You can't really see it too clearly, but these are the First Nations in British Columbia. But you'll see how many, all the different, they're all listed there. All in here. And there's also the different inset maps that kind of focuses in more. But you'll get a copy of this so you can have a look at it in more detail once we're done here. But I just wanted you to have a look so that you get an idea when we talk about the population in British Columbia and the diversity. That's where a lot of these nations are. Okay, so I'm just going to talk a little bit about the history of what's happened to Indigenous peoples, and I'm going to take a look at just mention some of the historical trauma periods. Of course, there was first contact, and at this point, there was a total environmental and life world shock. The life world of the Native people was systematically destroyed through genocidal military actions. Grief and bereavement for losses were not possible yet due to other traumatic events that quickly followed. The economic competition, similar to first phase, lands and wildlife that was used for sustenance were destroyed or taken by European settlers. The relationship towards the land changed to consumption rather than living with it. During this phase, Native people suffered the losses both physically and spiritually. Subjugation and reservation period in Canada, 1850s onward. Native peoples were subdued and relocated from their traditional homelands and forced to live within the confines of segregated and impoverished reservations. Boarding school period, 1875 to the 1990s. Some Native people will or still retained Native identity. The government decided to attack systematically the core of Native identity, for example, the family system, removing children from parents and placing them in distant boarding schools became the policy, and it wasn't forced. The 60s scoop refers to a particular time in history, roughly 1961 to the 1980s. During the 1980s, the government changed child welfare laws so that bands could run their own social. Child apprehension became viewed as successor to the residential school system and as a new form of cultural genocide. Sorry, that print is small. I had trouble reading that one. But I just also wanted to point out in our history in Canada, the Canadian government doesn't like to hear the word genocide. And I think I might have got myself in trouble if I maybe talked about it a little bit too much coming through customs at Vancouver, because it's something that a lot of governments don't like to hear. But that's what a lot of our leaders and our people say happened to Indigenous people in our country. It was assimilation was for the purpose of genocide. Many of us lost our identities, we lost our culture, we don't know a lot of our traditions, and now we're just moving forward to resurging to reclaim our language. So there's a large movement in language learning within our countries, now our communities across the country. And some of the governments, both provincial and federal, are starting to invest more money into providing support for language reclamation. And in my community alone, I think we might only have, if we're lucky, 6 fluent speakers in the elder population that we have. So that's why it's really important for us to try and regain our language. And that's one of the reasons why in my classes every day, we start with how I demonstrated here this morning. We start with drumming. We do a prayer in the language, and each of the students either introduce themselves in the local Halkaminam language of the territory, or they can choose to introduce themselves in their own language if they're wanting to, of course, continue to learn and practice their language. But that's the purpose of that is to demonstrate that it's really important and necessary for especially non-Indigenous students, because our student population is more non-Indigenous now than they are Indigenous, to show that it's a need for us to be able to have the space to learn and practice our language. And I kind of put it to them as, when the Europeans came to our country and they were negotiating for treaties that were concluded, and our people didn't understand what these treaties said, and they signed them off. It's a similar juxtaposition where they're listening to English that they couldn't understand. So we have non-Indigenous students who are very shy at the beginning, but by the end of the year, they get pretty fluent in being able to introduce themselves in the language. And to me, it's a show of a demonstration of how it must have felt for Indigenous people when they couldn't understand English. So that was kind of doing a mental shift, I suppose. So I'm going to now go into a bit about the residential school system and what we refer to as a trail of disease and death in Canada. They consisted of 139 church-run residences, industrial, and boarding schools. They operated in Canada between 1830 and 1996, which wasn't that long ago. The last residential school was in Saskatchewan that recently closed. Colonization led to the destruction of the cultural foundation of many Indigenous communities in Canada. According to J.R. Miller, residential schools were government-sponsored religious schools established to assimilate Indigenous children into Euro-Canadian society. These schools were conceived by Christian churches. This particular map shows the residential schools that were located in British Columbia. And it says that the ones that are in red are still standing, but I can tell you that St. Michael's is no longer standing. The community took that one down. And the other three, Kamloops, Kokalitsa, and St. Eugene's are still standing. And the St. Eugene's has been turned into a world-class destination resort and in collaboration with the communities in that territory. And it's a Delta hotel with a large golf course. So they thought they would try and promote some kind of economic development to return an economic base back to the communities. So that's why they decided to do that. But for some people, the pain is too difficult, so they need the structures to come down. The one that I attended here was initially called St. Joseph's Mission, but when I left when I attended there, it was called a Caribou Student Residence. And it was because my grandparents were getting elderly and they couldn't take care of me anymore because they lived on a meager pension. So they put me into the residential school at about the age 12. And I was there for 3 years. And my dad also attended this same residential school, plus his dad. I'm just going to show you a couple examples of some of the residential schools in Canada. So this one's Fort Qu'Appelle, Saskatchewan. It says founded in 1909, closed in 2004. So it's likely that there were other things happening within because the last residential school operated by the government closed in 1996. This Qu'Appelle Indian Industrial School in Saskatchewan, 1885. What I found important to share about this one is that you'll see in this slide that parents of First Nations children had to camp outside the gates, and they're shown here, in order to visit their children. And what we found out is that they could have camped there for quite some time, maybe a week or two, maybe a month, who knows. But it wasn't a guarantee that they would see their children. Some of them would camp there and hold out and never be able to have a visit with their children. So that's part of the very harsh circumstances in making sure that Indigenous children were removed from their families and communities. This particular residential school is the one that I mentioned, St. Joseph's Mission, also called Caribou Indian Residential School. And a lot of these residential schools also had activities where they could have these students participate in. So this one is the girls' pipe band, and they got to travel and travel around and participate in the pipe band. So for some it was very welcoming and maybe an escape from some of the realities from being in the residential school. So some students found that a distraction maybe. So that's what they did. This building has also been torn down. The only building on the site is the gymnasium and the accommodations for the workers that were looking after the students at this school. You'll hear me sometimes say students and school, but a lot of our people get really annoyed with that because they weren't schools. They didn't go in there to get an education. They went in there to get taught more about industrial labor, and different practices were for the boys, and then there were others for the girls, like farming or sewing and cooking, all those kinds of activities. It wasn't education. So, but that's what they've been referred to, and that's what we continue to refer to them as. Okay, I've got another. Running out of time. I just wanted to show this map to point out how many, don't go in, how many residential schools were across Canada. So this is, you can actually go to this site. It's a pretty good site, and you can find more information if you want to learn more. Okay, next one. I have to go quicker. Don't worry too much about it. Okay. Okay, can just play it. Okay. This is a short video about the history.
For more than 200 years, religious orders run mission schools for Indigenous children, the precursors to the Government of Canada's residential school system. The Mohawk Institute becomes a boarding school. Run by the Anglican Church, it is the first government-funded residential school in Canada. A government report recommends Indigenous children be separated from their parents in order to assimilate them into Western culture. These recommendations influence federal laws and policies designed to strip Indigenous people of their culture and rights. Isle Lacrosse opens in northern Saskatchewan. The majority of students are Métis. The government takes authority over Indigenous people and education for First Nations. The Indian Act gives the Canadian government control over Indigenous rights and culture. The Act includes only First Nations as status Indians. It excludes Métis and Inuit. Prime Minister John A. Macdonald authorizes the creation of the residential school system, which is designed to isolate Indigenous children from their families and cut all ties to their cultures.
Macdonald authorizes the creation of the residential school system, which is designed to isolate Indigenous children from their families and cut all ties to their cultures. The number of schools across Canada quickly climbs to over 40. The Government of Canada requires First Nations children aged 7 to 16 to attend residential school. Dr. Peter Henderson Bryce exposes the government's neglect of Indigenous children's health, including alarmingly high death rates of residential school students. More than 80 institutions are in operation across Canada, the most at any one time. 4 students are investigated for arson. Others reportedly cheer as they watch the school burn. This is one of dozens of fires set by students across Canada as a form of resistance. Inuit children are officially included in the residential school system. 6 schools open in the Western Arctic as the government takes over the administration of many church-run residential schools. Grolier Hall and Stringer Hall open in Inuvik, housing 500 students. More than 20,000 Indigenous children are taken from their families by government social workers and placed in foster care or adoption homes, often with non-Indigenous families. Adoptees lose connection with their Indigenous language, culture, and identity. 12-year-old Chani Wenjak dies after escaping from the Cecilia Jeffrey Residential School. A formal investigation follows. The all-white jury finds that residential schools cause tremendous emotional and psychological problems. The Canadian government takes over responsibility for the remaining schools from the churches. Thousands of Indigenous students are enrolled at the 28 residential schools that are still running in Canada. Phil Fontaine, head of the Assembly of Manitoba Chiefs, speaks publicly of the abuse he suffered at Fort Alexander Indian Residential School. He calls for a public inquiry, which the federal government initiates in 1991. Gordon's Residential School is the last federally run school to close. The report recommends a public inquiry into the effects of residential schools, including language loss and trauma. The government provides compensation to survivors, including the Common Experience Payment and a focus on funding and supporting Indigenous health and healing services. The agreement establishes funds for the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, or the TRC. Prime Minister Stephen Harper apologizes to former students, their families, and communities for Canada's role in the operation of residential schools. Provincial and territorial apologies follow in the years ahead. After hosting events across Canada, the TRC releases a summary of its findings. It includes 94 calls to action aimed at redressing the legacy of residential schools and assisting in the process of Canadian reconciliation. The News Centre holds a permanent archive of materials and testimonies on residential schools gathered during the TRC. The TRC characterizes Canada's treatment of Indigenous people as cultural genocide. Thousands of children died due to Canada's residential school system. More than 80,000 survivors and their families still live with its legacy.
Many people have said over the years, why can't you just get over it and move on? And my answer has always been, why can't you always remember this? And until people show that they have learned from this, we will never forget.
So I just wanted to kind of I'll just show some of the photographs and I'll talk a little bit about the Truth and Reconciliation because I'm running out of time. So I just showed a picture of these nuns holding babies because it reminds me of how my dad was raised and his dad. My dad was in residential school at 5 years old. So the way that he was raised is the perfect reason why he didn't have parenting skills. So a lot of us have a lot of breakdown and disruption in our own person and also in our communities. I wanted to show this picture just to give a snapshot of how many children in this one picture alone have been affected by Indian residential schools. And as a result of them being in these residential schools, Eduardo Duran refers to cumulative, the soul wound being cumulative trauma. So that means because my grandfather, my father, and myself went to residential school, all of those years have been now put on to my children and their children. And until we're able to get to a path where we can claim and reclaim and do our own wellness, we're still packing all of those years of trauma. There was some mention about the Indian Act, but these slides will also be available, and I'm just going to flip through them now because I want to get to the There was mention of Indian reservations. We're still on reservations, and we're still under control of the federal government under the Indian Act of 1876. So we don't have the same setup as you do here within your territories. We are on reservations. So under Section 35(2) of the Constitution Act, when it was repatriated back to Canada, there is a section in this act that refers to Aboriginal people with existing Aboriginal and treaty rights, and they're recognized and affirmed. And they also included Indian, Inuit, and Métis peoples of Canada. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada was created through a legal settlement between residential school survivors, the Assembly of First Nations, Inuit representatives, and the parties responsible for creation and operation of the schools, the federal government, and the church bodies, and working with the Indian Residential School History and Dialogue Center. The message that they're hoping that we will put out there and continue to promote is that this was not an initiative of the government to initiate the Indian Residential School or the Truth and Reconciliation. It comes on the backs of the survivors. The survivors are the ones who went to court and did the litigation to bring attention and action to get the Truth and Reconciliation going. So it was established following Stephen Harper's apology in the House of Commons in 2008. And many of our leaders across the country are not accepting what he refers to as an apology. You can go back and find it on the internet and listen to it again, but it was more lip service or rhetoric. There's no real strong support from the federal government, but it's, I guess one of my students refers to it as performative, and we refer to it as lip service. The TRC's mandate was to inform all Canadians about what happened in residential schools, and it documented the truth of survivors, their families, communities, and anyone personally affected by the residential school experience. So out of the court case, it's referred to as the Blackwater court case. That was the initial one, and it happened on Vancouver Island. So there were a group of men who had the courage and strength to challenge through the courts, and they were able to get the common experience payment for survivors. And the common experience payment allowed for $10,000 for the first year and $3,000 for each additional year that we attended the residential school. So my payment was $16,000. And if you wanted to go through the trauma and grief of fighting for more compensation, you could do it through the courts for physical and sexual abuse, and emotional, but many people didn't have the strength to do that. So some either accepted the minimum payout or didn't even bother applying for any of it. So there was a different approach depending on the person. So the Truth and Reconciliation Commission completed its mandate in 2015. All of the records, as was mentioned in the short video, is in safekeeping at the National Center for Truth and Reconciliation. They created 94 calls to action, and to date, out of the 94, only 13 have been completed. And they're 13 of the easiest ones. So it may look like Canada is really moving forward and progressive on the outside, but really in our country, things are not as great as they're making it out to be. The National Day for Truth and Reconciliation, this happens every day now on September 30th, and it's known as National Day for Truth and Reconciliation, and it's to honor the children who never returned home and survivors of residential schools, as well as their families and communities. And it was also in collaboration with Orange Shirt Day, this one is an Indigenous-led grassroots movement by Phyllis Webstad, and she's from my nation and also went to St. Joseph's Mission within my territory. So these are the pins that they share as well, the Orange Shirt Day. But we're seeing all kinds of different marketing happening to do with Orange Shirt now, and it's referred to as Every Child Matters. So now we're starting to see it become sort of commercialized, and it seems to be moving away from the grassroots movement. But the one thing that we're really watching is to make sure that the federal government does not take recognition for having this movement occur from them. It really comes from Indigenous people again. So we're trying to be really careful about that. So Gukshjajam, that's thank you in my language. And I'm going to do the final drum song. So this drum song I learned while I was working through my PhD program at the University of British Columbia. I learned it from Alana Young-Leon and Dorothy Christian. And the way they teach us is that we have to also honor the protocol of the songs. So before I begin, I just explained that the song comes from Martina Pierre and Faye Nelson from Mount Currie. They were in the sweat at the time, and the song came to Martina Pierre. It is a song especially for the women because we are the life givers and the caretakers of our communities from babies all the way up to the elders. And it is a public song, so we hear it a lot in the murdered and missing women's marches, and also for the land defenders use it quite often. And it's just give us strength when we need it, and it's also considered a prayer song. So before I begin, I have one beat for each of the 4 directions and a succession of shorter beats to call the ancestors forward to be with us here today. Yahi-yo, hey, hey, yahi-yo, hey, 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 yahi-yo, yahi-yo, hey, hey, yahi-yo, yahi-yo, hey, hey, yahi-yo. Gukshjajam, all my relations.
But we probably have a few minutes for questions, but I'll defer to the organizers. Yes, Dr. Rizita says we have time for questions, and there might be some online questions as well.
In our culture, it's proper for us to respond when something has been offered to us to make sure that we have social and spiritual balance. And so what I would like to do is offer a sorrow song for all of our children. Okay. All of our children. Thank you. Yeah.
to questions, and if there's any online questions, I think Station might help me with that. Or comments? Yes, sir.
Thank you so much, Dr. Martin, for coming to speak with us. I was curious about those other calls to action that the Truth and Reconciliation Commission proposed that you mentioned weren't fulfilled, and what those look like, and whether there are any that there's significant maybe political pressure right now that advocacy groups are pushing for, or what that's looking like right now.
There are 94 calls to action, and you actually can find them online. And it also has online how many of them have been recognized. And what I know is that they chose the easier ones, like making National Truth and Reconciliation Day. I refer to that as a day of remembrance, but now it's becoming, people are treating it like a holiday, and we're trying to tell people it's not a holiday. So they're putting up some monuments and things in different places across the country, but there isn't anything that's been substantial or significant. And we're not really seeing any pressure, any political pressure. Maybe it'll change with Wab Kinew being one of the new premier of Manitoba, and he's Indigenous. So we might get more attention with Indigenous issues across the country, but they're very complacent. They're, like I said, it's performative, is the way that we're seeing it. And even at our universities, we have Orange Shirt Day or TRC Day, now that they're combining them. And we're starting to get an increase in participation, but it's slow. The growth is slow. Thank you. You're welcome. The one thing I also wanted to point out, but ran out of time in the presentations, is there's been a lot of focus on residential schools. And I personally have a project that's trying to advance recognition of intergenerational survivors, because we have many. So I'm trying to create a program where we can pay more attention to youth and try and get them to be more involved in their culture and their languages, because we're at a point where could potentially be extinct with our languages and our culture.
There's a question in the back.
Hi, thank you for coming. I have a quick question about the recent, I was going to ask about Wab Kinew, your thoughts on political pressure, so thank you for addressing that. But the recent discovery of the graves of all the children, not really recent, but over the past few years, is that more of are we seeing the federal government be a willing aid in that? Are they providing federal dollars for those graves to be discovered, and for the equipment for them to be properly identified? Are they willing in that effort, or is it still mainly grassroots?
Yeah, I also had that in the presentation, but like I said, I was running out of time. The 215 anomalies that were found were actually in my territory, in the Kamloops to Swetmuk territory. So that was an initiative that the people did on their own, and even using the ground penetrating research, a lot of the scientists and scholars are downplaying it. They're saying that that's not really a proper way of identifying whether or not these are bodies. But there hasn't been a lot of support from the government. Indigenous people in our country have to fight for everything. We're very poor. Like we don't have proper drinking water in our communities, or housing, or, we're like refugees in our own country. So we don't get a lot of support until we have people who will back certain people to put on some of that pressure. So yeah, it's not forthcoming. Like I said, and there's been a lot more found across the country, and it's been really, really increasing. And at St. Joseph's Mission, where I showed you, initially it was around 63, now it's gone over 100. So they keep being identified, but there's very little. Just like the situation in Manitoba, where they want to search the the dump site for the missing women, and they keep refusing because they say they don't have the money or they have to do a feasibility or whatever. It's no, we're not getting much attention at all.
One last question we have time for, sir.
I just want to know if many of your people right now are becoming politically active so that they can bring out these points that you're talking about too, and they're becoming elected into the local political parties, that you need those people to go to. And I think that's one of the things that's helped Alaska many times over.
Yeah, we've had a lot of very important leaders who have fought for self-government and the land question over the years. And we're still under the Indian Act, so that means we're legislated. So we have very little movement in taking care of our own affairs or even governing within our own communities. So, and because of the way that the legislation has been set up as well, I feel that there are many Indigenous people who do not want to participate in these systems of municipal, provincial, or federal governments, because it wasn't until 1960 that we even had the ability to vote. Before that, we had to give up our Indian status and become citizens of the country so that we could vote. So I think it's left a very bad taste in many Indigenous people that I know I did campaigning for one of the parties one year going into the communities, and their response was, well, why do they want our vote now? They didn't want it before. And they're very not trusting of the government. So.
Well, thank you, everybody. Thank you to Stacia for making this happen. Thank you to our technical crew, and thank you all for coming. Let's give another round of applause.